Alrighty, this is part two of the family counselor's experiences with multiculturalism. And I am on slide number 9 if you're following along with the PowerPoint attachment. So multiculturalism meets family therapy. For a while, the field of family counseling was evolving on its own, and then the field of multiculturalism was a more younger wing of the counseling party. And so eventually those two had to merge, and the lens of multiculturalism had to be applied to the field of family counseling. And we know that this has been a very important thing to do because culture obviously influences parenting, family rituals, communication styles, problem resolution skills, the levels of emotional expressiveness with families. So when we start to study specific groups of families, such as in a previous slide, there was a discussion of different types of Asian American family traits that have been observed in research. When we start to look at these different patterns of behavior in different cultural groups, we need to be mindful of, while we can identify generalizations about cultural groups, that there are always going to be differences within those groups of people. So we don't want to use multiculturalism and culture-specific knowledge to do the same thing that prejudice would have us do, which would be to overgeneralize patterns of behavior in a way that restricts understanding of those groups of people. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I kind of stumbled over my words a little bit there. But basically, we just need to know that there are patterns of behavior among cultural groups that we can learn something about. But even when we learn about those patterns, there are going to be within group differences. Not every Asian American family is going to be modeled after the article or the book chapter that we go out and read about Asian American families. So we need to allow room for some variation. We also need to be aware that there are an increasing number of multiracial families that are entering into counseling. And these families, they come into counseling with many of the same presenting problems that non-minority or non-multiracial families come into counseling for, such as marital problems, children acting out, difficulties with teenagers, blending families, but so that they're having those same types of family issues and stressors, but their problems might be exacerbated by what it's like to be a member of that cultural group within the particular region that they live in. So whether that be what it's like to be a member of a minority group in the South versus a member of a minority group in the North, in a wealthy region versus a economically impoverished region, and so forth. So we need to understand that even when families presenting concerns are similar, their experiences of those concerns in their day-to-day lives may be different. All right, trying to move to slide number 10. Okay, so this is where I'm going to get into talking a little bit about the research that I did with my dissertation, and that was a qualitative study of 11 family counselors' experiences of multiculturalism and their professional practices. And what I wanted to know was family counselors that are out there actually in practice and doing family counseling on a regular basis, and not just a strictly academic setting of that kind of work, then what are they experiencing? What kind of culture-related issues are coming up for them? What are some of the things that they wish that they had learned? What are some things about themselves if you think back to that pyramid of self-reflection, knowledge, and skills? You know, what are the self-reflection issues that they're having? What is the knowledge that they need or have had to acquire? And then what are the skills that they're using? And when I was selecting my sample from the population of all the family counselors out there, I said that I'm looking for family counselors who have had at least 2 years of experience so that they're not brand new, because I think for brand new family counselors, it's a much more self-focused part of your professional development. You're very focused on um, learning to be in that new professional role. And I wanted family counselors who had had experience of working with clients who were different than them. The way that my participants interacted in the study was they sent in email reflections about their work. We did multiple phone interviews where I would record what we were saying. We did in-person interviews. I would go to their offices and talk to them about their work and record those and then transcribe all of those sessions. They also did an artifact creation where they used a visual representation, such as a photograph or some to be a metaphor for the role of multiculturalism in their professional practice. And then finally, I also wanted to do an assessment of their conceptual level. We know that as counselors increase in their conceptualization skills, that they are better able to account for multicultural or cultural variation and flex their practice to meet different needs. So I'm going to go through just some of the highlights of some of the different participants in my study and talk a little bit about what their experiences were. One student, her pseudonym was Lynn, and she was over the age of 30. She considered herself to be an Irish American. She had a master's degree and had worked in the community and also in private practice. So she worked in an agency setting and also in private practice with families. And one of the quotes that she left within the study was that it gave her a sense of pride to know who she was and where she came from, and then to be able to share that with clients. So she actually had things in her office that were important to her as an Irish American, and she would talk a little bit about that with her clients. She grew up in an ethnically diverse neighborhood, by her account, that was north of Virginia. And when she moved further south, she was really surprised to hear other white people speaking to her with racist remarks and assuming that she would want to participate in that kind of a conversation. And she was particularly surprised to hear that in church. So those are some of her own experiences about race, and through those experiences she did some of the self-examination and self-awareness building. She noted in her practice that there was a lot of variation in discipline techniques in families, and it seemed to her there was a lot of variation in discipline techniques within different racial groups of the families that she worked with. She said she gained a lot of self-awareness and a lot of knowledge by doing a study abroad. She went to Guatemala and participated in some counseling-related activities there, and found that to be a real growth-inducing aspect of her professional development. The Band-Aids and hosiery, one thing that was kind of interesting about her was she remarked that during her multicultural counseling class in her master's degree program, that the instructor pointed out that Band-Aids and women's hosiery, pantyhose, are culturally bound, and they're often manufactured to be for white people's skin and not for persons of color. And she was saying that that was a point of awareness for her that she had never thought of. So I share that with you so you can use Lynn's experiences to start to reflect on some of your own experiences. And if you have a background that is very different than Lynn, then maybe you can understand through her experience what it would be like for her to evolve. So Anna was another one of the study participants. She was also in her 30s. She was from a self-described Caucasian working class family. She had her master's degree. She worked in the community doing family counseling, and some of that was in-home family counseling. She herself was married to an African-American man, and they had two multiracial sons. She described how clients often viewed her, when they would see her as a white woman, when she worked with African American clients, that she felt that maybe they didn't look at her as someone that would necessarily understand their point of view all the time. And then she talked about running into a client when she was out with her family, and her client was so surprised to find out that she was married to an African American man and that they had 2 children together. And she was surprised to find out that her client was surprised to realize this about her. She noted that when she did family counseling, that as she pulled into her clients' neighborhoods, she felt like all eyes were on her. And this is a quote that she said, so just the socioeconomic is a barrier, and then you have to extend out. Then you have the cultural issues, and then I'm stepping into their homes, and I'm a white woman. And she's implying that she's stepping into the homes of people who are racially different than her, and also socioeconomically different than her. She says, it's one thing for them to step into your office on their terms, but I'm going into their home and seeing everything out like an open book. And that is a very that's a very common experience of counselors who are going into the homes. You have to be very sensitive to the fact that you're coming into your client's world. They're not stepping into your office, and there are some advantages to that, but there are also some disadvantages too, or not necessarily disadvantages, but an extra layer of sensitivity that you need to use when you go into that environment. Then we have Charlotte. Charlotte was raised in Germany, lived in Canada, then North Carolina, and then Virginia. She's in an interracial marriage herself, and she considered herself to be a Filipino Asian American. And she says that every time she started to identify some kind of cultural pattern, that it would blow up in her face, and she would inevitably next have a family on her caseload that would make her a personal theory that she'd come up with, or the pattern that she had observed, she would make that, it would blow up in her face, and it would be irrelevant because the next family that came along would be an outlier to that. One of the things that was interesting in talking to this woman was that as a woman of color and doing in-home family counseling, she was actually a family that she was working with, a white family that had racist values themselves, did not want her to work with their family, and the father would not let her onto his property, and raised some real interesting issues in that. I'm going to move through that slide real quickly. So participants who identified with a specific race or ethnic group had higher levels of integration of personal and professional identity in the study that I did. There were several that noted how their age was a factor. And I am running out of time. I'm going to pause the video briefly. Okay, I only have about a minute left in how much this will let me record, and I'm jumping ahead to slide number 21. You can read through the other slides on your own about some of the other experiences of the participants in the study, but one of the major findings of the work were what encouraged counselors to have multicultural dialogues with their client families. And what I found was that the counselors who intentionally engaged in self-reflection, who did journaling, who learned about their own personal culture, who traveled to places different than their own current world, and did reading about other cultures, were much more likely to be comfortable working with families who are different than them, and much more likely to be effective with families that were different than them. Clients, when they did work with clients, some of the skills that they used were that they used broaching, they used different ways of asking clients about their culture, and made culture a very important part of their family work. They tapped into what was important to their clients in terms of spirituality. They processed issues of interracial dating and differences between generational expectations of adolescents and their parents. They worked freely and welcomed the challenge of working with multiracial families. They talked about families' experiences of racism and didn't sweep that under the rug. And they also were working with their coworkers and their supervisors, made a point of having multicultural dialogues. You can see that they were intentional about making culture an important part of their professional development.